In this episode of the podcast, I get to sit down with Elisa Iannacone. She is an author, a speaker, and a cinematographer. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Light Artists Podcast. I am your host, Frederick Van Johnson. In today's episode, we get to have a really deep conversation, and I'm not even gonna kind of reveal what we're gonna talk about. This is gonna be a journey for you to kind of go into the mind of Elisa and some of the things that she's gone through and has experienced, as well as how those experiences has shaped her approach to creativity, to photography, cinematography, as well as this new drop that Light is putting out in conjunction with this interview. So we're going to dive into all that in this interview, but first, welcome, Elisa. How's it going?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it is so great to have you. You know what? I was very rarely do I feel intimidated by, almost anything. Sometimes, but almost anything. Reading your bio, ma'am. Reading your bio put me on my heels because I'm like, wow, I want my name to be in there. That's what a CV. That is amazing. And the body of work and the direction that you have chosen to move in for the reasons that we're going to dive into in this interview, just amazing. So first off, I made a note to myself to say that and say congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. And I know you have a ton of things that you're going to be doing in the future. So first off, thank you for doing this and congratulations. Stunning body of work.
That was unexpected, and thank you so much. It's very kind, and thank you for checking out my work.
Absolutely. As the Italians would say, it's what I do, right? So let's dive in. Let's get a little background on you. And folks, I would encourage you to go to Elisa's website, and it's just her name, Elisa Iannacone, and it'll be linked into the show notes and to the YouTube video description. So definitely follow along and go to her website, check out all the things, and to the light.art website where this video is hosted. You may be watching it there now, and it'll have all the links as well. So let's dive into your background a little bit, Lisa. Tell me, how did you get into this crazy world of creativity before all this other stuff happened? How did you get into this world of telling stories through various mediums?
Well, I'm originally from Mexico, and I grew up watching a lot of films. And when I say a lot of films, I mean, I was a very sick kid growing up, and I used to spend sometimes 2 weeks at home, 2 weeks in school until I was about 16 years old, which meant that to cope, I watched a huge amount of films. And initially, I just felt very, very attached to telling stories in that way, which led me to going into film school. From there, I decided that I wanted to see the world, learn about other cultures, ended up living in about 50 countries, shooting, traveling, doing interviews, doing kind of more journalistic things. Kind of deviated from that a bit into conflict reporting, and then learned about compassion fatigue and kind of the desperation of wanting to tell a human rights story that wasn't really getting through because sometimes broadcasters can't show what's happening. Sometimes people are just exhausted of another painful story, and just trying to find new ways to tell stories and turn an audience that seems to be passive into an active audience again. And that's how I kind of landed up at magical realism.
Yeah, I love that. And that's so right, and I wonder, you touched on the whole idea of, okay, there's a story that needs to be told, and I feel like people need to know about this. And I'm going to tell this story, like we were saying before we started recording, I'm going to tell this story using my superpowers as a creative, right? So what kind of blocks have you hit with that, right? Telling stories, like, for example, some human interest story in a country adjacent to where you are, and you want to go there. You go there to do one story, and something else reveals itself. You're like, holy crap, look at that. The world needs to know what's going on here. How do you get from the world needs to know what's going on here to actually doing it and publishing it? What's the journey?
I think it's just about trying to think about it differently, because I think most human rights stories we've kind of seen in a particular way already, right? So if it's a war, if I say the word war, I'm sure that there's images that flood your mind. If I say the word sexual violence, if I say, domestic violence, I think that we've almost been preconditioned to have our brains go to certain places when we hear these words. And I think it's that same preconception that detaches us from, really connecting to the stories. And so I think if we try to just sit down and start to just really listen to what's around. So, exactly what you said. I remember one time going into Mozambique after Cyclone Idai had hit, and I was doing a piece for Newsweek, and I ended up doing a piece for other outlets. And, I wanted to find a way to tell that story that wasn't literally a cyclone hit and there's destroyed houses. And, so I ended up connecting with a group of artists that had lost their musical instruments. And that only came through walking around, chatting to people, meeting someone and saying, hey, I used to play the piano and now my piano, left with the flood, and I used to have a drum and now it's broken, and just learning about artists and the connection that they have to them. And it's basically telling the same story. There's a cyclone that hit, but then it's finding that little alternate angle. Mm-hmm. And so I think when I'm trying to tackle a project on a larger scale, like for this NFT drop, it was just a matter of finding something that sparked a different visual or a kind of alternate angle. And in this case, it was art therapy. So I personally did art therapy in the past and learned that to process trauma, you can do a collage, or you can listen to a poem and then draw, or you can dance, or you can do all these different things. And there's a massive realm in the imagination where we can tackle these topics. And so that was kind of the entry point for me, exploring a new way to tell stories.
Yeah. And I'm curious about the NFT stuff, and I want to talk about the drop shortly that you're doing with Light.art. But there's a couple of key phrases that I actually wrote down notes on. So art therapy, I want to talk about that. But then also the power of NFTs and using that as a distribution mechanism for important work like this. Again, before we started recording, we're chit-chatting about how, in the NFT space, there's a ton of beautiful, amazing work that artists are putting out there, but I haven't seen a whole lot. I've seen some, but I haven't seen a whole lot that are using that mechanism, the NFT mechanism, to tell stories like you're telling with this drop. Can you talk about that a little bit? How you feel about the NFT space? Do you feel like it's liberating versus getting a contract from, Newsweek or someone like that to cover a story? You're going to self-publish it on your own through NFTs and have that mechanism behind it. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it an and? Is it an or? What do you think?
I think it's just different. And I think right now, still in the NFT space, we're still at the experimentation kind of stages, because it's quite a recent thing. I mean, it's been going on for several years, but to really use it as a platform, I think, through having joined Clubhouse and getting into different of these conversations, I was learning a little bit during the pandemic about how people are using drops for charity. And I think it's definitely a space that needs to be explored. I mean, I think there's no one path. I think each media form can provide something positive, but I certainly think in the NFT space is it's democratizing, right, of art, and it's gaining access to something at, different geographies, different platforms. Anyone can really take part in this, and I do quite like that. And I think it also kind of encourages people to become attached to causes, because in the NFT world, yes, there are very beautiful things. There are kind of some things that are still question marks to me that I don't fully grasp and understand.
I know what you're talking about. Yep.
It's just, and so I think that there's space for all of this. I think there's space for us to watch kittens and, TikTok all day and have kittens in the NFT space and whatever. And that almost comes as a reaction from the bombardment of heavy loaded context that we get exposed to every single day. So people need respite. But I think, when people kind of regain themselves and they want to care about a cause, that NFTs are a really good platform to try to do that as well. So I think, it's still exploratory, but I think there's a massive scope as to where this can go. I wonder, playing devil's advocate, I wonder, for the uninitiated
people, which is the majority of people on the planet right now that are uninitiated into NFTs and crypto and all that. I think a lot of people are still, kind of approaching it with trepidation or, curiosity. I'm going to sit on the sidelines and wait for it to become more real or whatever. But, for those people that haven't really dove into the space yet, if one of the arguments that I hear is, okay, yeah, I can make an NFT, but why don't I just put it on a website? Why don't I just put it on a website and put a price list there? If people want to buy it, they can buy it. They can use their credit card. What's all this overhead with this NFT stuff? Why should I care? Like, what do you think about that? What does NFT, doing this drop with light, what does it bring to the table that wouldn't be on the table if you had distributed the works another way?
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things about it is that when you do drop on NFT format, right, what you're really effectively getting, what I've understood, you're really buying like a receipt of the work, right? Yeah. It's not per se the work, but it's this receipt. And this is something that cannot be replicated, right? So if I put something on a website and you screen grab it and then you print it and then somebody downloads it and then, there's like no control, there's no way to really know where the art is going, etc. And in this sense, it's something where it's unique, it's a one-off, it's a good cause, and in that sense, you can actually track where it goes. So if somebody sells it again, right, we can suddenly actually start to see, okay, where is this artwork actually going? Where are people actually becoming interested in this? What kind of investor profiles are coming into this space? And I think that traceability factor is something that otherwise in the internet we'd never be able to have. The fact that would also give back to the artists, because as artists, right, you do the one thing, you sell your painting, you sell your, sculpture, and that's it. That's the end of it. Whereas with this, you can actually see a little bit of, royalty streams, like this kind of thing. And that might change, right? Right now we have that. It might diminish, it might evolve. But I think that traceability, it's almost like blockchain, right? It's that importance of knowing where things are going and having some form of control in this kind of completely crazy space, especially when we start to go meta versus, conversations. I mean, having some form of traceability, I think is important. And it gives value to the work that you buy as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, and the idea as we move forward, like this conversation that we're having 10 years ago would have been science fiction, right? No one would have understood whatever. This is what are you talking? What And now today, as we move forward, people, I mean, even with crypto and what Facebook is doing and other companies are doing with this metaverse concept, it's becoming every day that ticks by, it's becoming more and more real that digital assets are tangible assets, right? We live in a digital world. We just don't want to admit it. Most of us spend most of our time in a digital world already, right? So why not have a receipt and have things? Yeah, exactly.
Well, and you are seeing the major auction houses, Sotheby's. You've seen major photographers like Salgado that's released NFTs. So, I mean, you're certainly seeing kind of larger, more blue chip kind of players enter the market, which initially, was not the case. So I think that also is an indicator for where things might be going.
Yeah. One of the things, that's a double-edged sword there too, because what happens when Chase Bank and Wells Fargo and Amazon and Facebook, Instagram.
The whole democratizing of art doesn't necessarily
mean democratizing, kind of eviscerating, whatever, however you want. So I want to talk about the Spiral of Containment work. Before we do that, maybe we'll segue into that from your definition of art therapy and what that means to you. Like, what is art therapy for the uninitiated?
Okay, so this is something that I came to. I didn't actually know that it existed, but I came to it over a decade ago. And so basically, the reason for making this kind of project was out of personal experience. And so I got offered at the time support by the government of Canada in the form of art therapy. And this was something completely new to me. And when I first walked into a room, I saw a bunch of women swinging scarves through the air. And I immediately thought to myself, this is not for me. This is like a bit too cuckoo. I can't do this. But out of respect, I was like, okay, I've come here. I'm going to, just sit down and do what I'm told to do. And what was really fascinating is that, okay, so this is kind of some form of warm up at the beginning. But basically what they do is present, the topic was always going to be sexual violence, right? It was for people that had experienced some form of sexual violence. And it was two facilitators that would generally present a quote, a poem, or something that would be reflective, right? They might talk a little bit about it, and it might reflect around common topics in the aftermath of something like this, like shame, like what if I had done things differently? Should I have, all these kinds of things. And then they just give you tools, and tools might come in the form of sand, like colored sand. It might come in the form of fabric. It might come in the form of collaging. Musical instruments, and they basically set you free for, I think it was like an hour and a half or something like this. And at the end of it, you could either tell the group what you'd made, or you could just listen. And so the first few times that I did something like this, I just listened. I just had no words. I'm a very verbose kind of person, but at the time I just didn't have anything. Yeah. And then when I started to see my feelings reflected in how other people were describing that they were feeling, I started to kind of open up, and I started to realize that my feelings were not unique. They were unique to me, but I think what I learned is that in the aftermath of trauma, particularly this type, the aftermath feelings are very universal, right? And it doesn't matter what cultural background, heritage, religion you might come from, everything crosses over. And so for me, art therapy was basically a means to getting myself grounded again to a level playing field where I could work again, because I had stopped shooting because of what happened. And it was the ability to kind of regain myself, build community, and then use art as a means to express and heal trauma. Yeah. And so I think using that as principles, right, to create, I just kind of kept using different things that I had learned when I was creating work.
Yeah. I want to dive into what happened to the extent that you feel like sharing, but and how that drove the work. I'm looking at the another screen here, the Spiral of Containment, Rapes Aftermath, right? Because that was the event was what drove this project. Can you talk about, to the extent that you feel comfortable talking about it, what happened, and then the segue into creating this body of work?
Yeah, sure. So, basically, I grew up in Mexico, as I mentioned before, and as most traditional Mexican families, we were a tight-knit group, Catholic, and I grew up as an only child. And I was very close to one particular cousin, an older cousin, that unfortunately got quite drunk at his birthday party one time that I managed to come back from Toronto, because I'd been studying film in Toronto, came back, and I was staying in his house and my aunt and uncle's house, and he raped me that night, and I was 23 years old. And what was very difficult for me that time is that, how they always talk about fight and flight as the two options that can happen in trauma. So I'm a very kind of active person. I've traveled by myself, very independent. And in that moment, I completely froze. So I had like the third option, which I never would have expected would have happened to me, because I've been in so many challenging environments and always seem to have a response or something, right? Yeah. And I think for me, it was because it was the one space in my life that I was safe, and that my guard was completely down, particularly with this one person that I never would have seen it coming from. And what's really not funny, but in retrospect been a big lesson for me, was that, like, as this was kind of happening, like, my gut was like already sensing like something was off, and my brain was going, no way, this person's like your brother, how dare you think that he could even do something like this to you, like, you're crazy. And I spent so much time in this loop, and by the time I was with it was already happening, right? So basically, as a result of this, I became quite vocal. Luckily, I called a friend that knew me very well and pushed me quite hard to start telling people from the get-go, which I did do, and it became a bit of a chain of events. That friend led me to another friend, and another friend called my mom up and said, put the phone to my ear and said, you're telling her now, kind of thing. And so in that sense, for my personality type, I was lucky that I had friends that knew me well enough to push me to start disclosing, because it was actually the best thing for me. And the problem with that was that I realized that incest was actually something very common in my family. And it's happened to many women in my family intergenerationally. And a lot of them have chosen to remain silent about it. And many were even, reaching out to me on social media and saying like, don't worry, don't say anything. It's going to be fine. This been through it as well. Just, you'll move on. Like, I'm here. It's fine. And then the other response from other parts of the family is that they just started deleting me on social media channels, right? And by the end of it, most people blocked me and deleted me. So my parents were supportive, but it created this massive rupture in the family. And, at 23, even though I was already an adult, it was just something so mammoth for me. Like it felt like a complete loss of my family and the people that I grew up with and spent Christmases and New Year's with and this kind of stuff. So it really derailed me. It derailed my career completely, and I was unable to pick up a camera for a good year. I became a telemarketer in a basement in Toronto, and I couldn't function, right? And this is when art therapy kind of came into my life, and that's what I really think started to get me back up to speed. But anyways, that's basically what happened.
When your relatives started deleting you off or unfollowing you or whatever off of social media, what was that? Was that because they just didn't want to hear what happened, or was it because there was some sort of, okay, we're going to side with the cousin over Elisa? What was the driving force?
This is where you get into deeply complex family situations, particularly when there's religion attached and all these kinds of things. So I can't possibly break this all down in the minutes that we have. But
sure.
Long story short, so my cousin was getting married in that time period, right? Obviously, I was going to be one of the bridesmaids, like these kinds of things. And I think at the time, I assessed whether if I was in the position of the person getting married, I would want to know as a woman. And after a lot of thinking about it, I came to the consensus that I would want to know, and I would like somebody to tell me. So I reached out to her to try and have a conversation. But by then, she'd already, I don't know what story she had been told, but basically she said, no, I've already heard it. I don't want to listen to this, and, completely block the communication. And I think what happened is, I think because so much of this story had happened in the family before, to people that were involved, in the close-knit circle around this, it's hard for someone to confront something in someone else when you haven't been able to confront it for yourself as well, right? Yeah. And I think each person has their own time for disclosing, if at all, and each person has their reasoning behind it. And so I think on one level, perhaps it was too hard to accept, to listen, to see that. I think on another level, it was dangerous. I mean, now I put myself in the position of my aunt and uncle, who were incredibly dear and close to me, for the majority of my life still. And if I'd known this about my son, I mean, would I do everything in my power to want to protect them? Hopefully I personally wouldn't, now that I've seen this, but I think that's what they chose to do. So I don't have the answers. I only have hypotheses, because I've been left quite a lot in the dark and been quite cut out of this part of the family. But all I can tell you is that on the receiving end, every time that this would happen, I would notice that this would happen. I just collapsed. I just felt like I was drowning. I felt like I couldn't contain the pain of it. And it just felt like losing people you love one by one without them even reaching out to you, Yeah. So I felt like I was drowning in the pain, if that makes sense.
It does. And, as I think about this, it occurred to me that these kind of events, traumatic events that happen in people's lives, a lot of people will minimize it, like you said, some of your family did, or blame the victim, all these things that we understand that happens in these kind of events. And I think about it, and tell me if this is even somewhere close to being accurate, but I think about it, not to be a nerd, but kind of like the blockchain, right? Something has occurred at this point and it's there forever, right? And you can't get rid of it. It is just gonna be there forever. It's part of you now. Like the going forward, I want to talk about this body of work now, the Spiral of Containment, Rape's Aftermath. What does that going forward look like, and how did it manifest in the Spiral of Containment, and what does that mean?
So I think for me, when I started doing art therapy, I had this consistent image coming into my mind, which is one of being nude with broken wings. And these wings were almost antler-like, and the bone structure was there, so the skeleton was there, but the feathers weren't. And it was this notion that everyone else, kept flying, and I felt like I had once had wings to be flying places, but they're now unusable, and you're now stuck, and nobody else cares because everyone else is flying over there, and you're on your own, right? And so that image kept coming to my mind. And after a few years, I just thought to myself, I'm going to just execute on this image. And why don't I just reach out to other people and see what their broken wings look like? We'll get together in my kitchen. We'll make these wings out of, whatever collage or I don't know. And we'll just share stories. And what ended up happening when I started talking to other people that had experienced the same thing was that people went, broken wings? No broken wings. I'm in a cage. Or actually, it's a red classic convertible car that I can't get out of my mind. Or, I feel like I was stuck in the eye of the storm, or I was stuck and I started to realize that everyone's kind of images that had stayed with them were all over the board. Some of them were really attached to colors that I never thought you could attach sexual violence to, like, for example, hot pink, because it was a ballerina dancer and she chose hot pink to start an organization for survivors back in Uganda, and hot pink was the color she chose. And yellow, because the dress was bright and it represented a sunny life, and then when it was torn, it was broken. So I kind of started going like, wow, there's different colors here. And as a cinematographer and visual creator, I started to kind of think, okay, I'm going to make a few of these, just not knowing where I was going with it. I shot 5. And after that, I realized that they were so attached to color that I just opened it up and I went, the color wheel, why don't I make 24 images? Each person can attach to a color in the color wheel that feels natural to them. And I'll do mine in black and white, which is not black and white, but it's just monochrome, right? To tie it all kind of together. So it's light, darkness, and the 24 color wheel, which is why you have 25 images for the Spiral of Containment Rapes Aftermath. And it's Rapes Aftermath because it's all about what comes later, what stays with people later. I would almost argue that the aftermath is harder than the incident itself sometimes, because it's the having to process what happened and then process the loss of identity, all the feelings, the shame, the guilt, the whatevers, and then the ripple effect of people that you lose and the ostracizing and, the career path that you thought you were taking that's now not happening, and the job that you thought you might have had and you're not having anymore. So I thought the aftermath was a really important space to work in and allow each person to kind of collaborate with me. I became a bit of a visual interpreter for what had stayed with them. So basically to tell me as much or as little as they wanted of their story. Some people didn't tell me at all what happened. Some people told me exactly in detail, but it was about what stayed with them. And I would sketch and then show them and say like, oh, what do you think of this? Like, does this kind of look? And they'd be like, oh yeah, this looks great, but this doesn't, and back and forth until we both went like, okay, I think this works. Let's do this. And that's how kind of the pieces came to be.
Yeah, fascinating. And that depth of thinking and where the sort of raw material or soil that you pulled from to make this piece or the series happen, that is what we were talking about before, right? Creating work that is important, that tells a narrative, and that is, exposing stories and events and feelings that may not have otherwise seen the light of day, right? So, I'm curious, from a cliche standpoint, people say whatever doesn't kill me will make me stronger. Right? We've all heard that. Do you feel like that is true in this case? Has this rape made you a stronger person, or has it derailed you and made you a different person than you would have been had this not happened?
I think both. I think we've all had our dark thoughts and our dark moments, and I certainly have had. And I think to me, it's kind of one of those ones where it's either like, if I wasn't gonna live my life, I could take it away. Like, that's an option. But if you're gonna choose to stay here, you're choosing to stay here. And that's the way I kind of explained it to myself. It's like, I've chosen to be here, so I might as well do my best at working through my shit. I don't know if I can swear, but
yeah, you can.
I can. Okay, so I'll do my best at working through my shit, right? And get myself the best version of myself that I can be, right? Because I have chosen to be here. And so when I started looking at it that way, I think that's where I gained my strength. I do think it inevitably forced me to become stronger, even though I wouldn't have liked it to happen in this way. You know, who knows what I would have become otherwise. And I think it's upsetting that my career was going quite nicely before this happened. And I think I had a lot of aspirations and things that were materializing. And sometimes it is frustrating to think, you know what, that was going really well. I wish I could have seen that through. But at the same time, you know, the silver lining, if you wish to call it, is like through this, I also found an artistic voice that I don't know that I would have found in a different way, right? And I think it's not something that happened by choice, I feel. And there is that frustration of seeing that my career was actually going places before this happened. And it would have been nice to see that through and kind of see where you might have landed at, right? Had not this come through and completely derailed everything. Yeah. Equally, though, I think that in a way I have found an artistic voice through this. It's kind of the silver lining, if you will, that allows me to be more empathetic and allows me to connect to stories that otherwise I might have not had the same level of access points that I have now. And I like that. And I enjoy being able to connect with someone in that kind of level of pain or darkness or whatever, and then finding ways to express that in a way that's more empowering. So in answer to your question, I don't think anyone wants something terrible to happen, because it is life. You know, it tends to go that terrible things do happen from time to time. And I think we do have choice in whether we let that be the end, and that is very tempting sometimes, or if we kind of decide, no, I'm going to take this and I'm going to try and make the most of it because I'm choosing to be here and I'm choosing to show up every day to my life. And I think that was kind of the route that I took, but it was hard. I must be honest. It was very, very difficult.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I literally can't imagine. You know, it does remind me of just, you know, in business, they say, you know, everyone's afraid of failure, or what happens if I lose this job or this gig or whatever. You know, I'm going to end up, terrible things are going to happen. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to be homeless, or et cetera, et cetera. And then when it happens, or something like that traumatic happens, and they're able to reach bottom and see that, you know, yeah, it sucks and it's horrible, but I'm still alive, you know, but now I have the knowledge of what that looks like when I go on with these other things where other people don't know what that bottom looks like. So you move forward with the superpower of knowledge, knowing that, you know, hey, I know that I could survive that thing. Therefore, this little storm, whatever, I could do that with, you know, with one arm tied back. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what, though, and I must, you know, caveat that with saying that at the time I was able to get government support, free therapy, you know what I mean? And somebody that literally went, we think art therapy would be good for you, pluck. You know, how many people actually have access to that? And, you know, so it did also come from a privileged space, right? I had friends and I could crash in their basement and, you know, they supported me. So it's like, even though I lost family and all that, I still had a support network, and not everybody has that. So I do think that in that sense, you know, my rock bottom and someone else's rock bottom would still look quite different. But but regardless, it's a place of real pain, and that I can definitely attest to. I can't imagine. I was looking at some of the photos, like this shot of, I'm guessing this is the woman in Uganda in the cage with the lions. Is that Uganda? So no, that one's in South Africa. And so that one was actually a case of incest. And so she came to me and she said, you know, I feel like I was placed in a cage, but I couldn't even try to leave my cage because I was surrounded by immediate danger, and the danger was my family. And so that was her in a childhood kind of scenario that this happened. And so as an adult, she wanted to be nude in this cage. And then we were thinking about, how do you represent danger, but kind of like in a familial kind of environment? And after a lot of brainstorming, we thought, what are you afraid of in South Africa? And it was like lions. Lions are quite dangerous, right? So we thought, okay, lions, a lion family is a very strong visual, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's also very clear that if you are in a cage surrounded by a lion family, you definitely don't want to leave that cage, right? And I think that alludes to exactly what she was going through.
Yeah, I'm looking at it. Yeah, and with your words, it's even heavier, right? Because you look at this poor woman stuck in this cage, right? But the cage is protecting her from the dangers that are out. Yeah, I totally get it. Amazing. Elisa, who would you say this body of work is for? Who is your target avatar for the work?
Look, there's one thing about this work that I know that, as you said, it's heavy because it's dealing with a topic that is difficult to address, right? And it's painful, but it's a topic that affects so much of humankind. The statistics for men and women going through this are absolutely astronomical in every country that I have visited, right? And so I think for me, it's for people that want to open up dialogue, that also are happy to include images in their collection that speak to re-empowering survivors, because so much about this work was about, not re-victimizing victims. If I see one more black and white photo of a woman with a bruise on her face in a bus station, you know what I mean? It's like, we need to stop perpetuating these narratives, right? Or it's the same thing with, black people in slavery, right? We know slavery happened. We don't need to see another black person in this situation, in my opinion. You know what I mean? It's like, we need to see people in situations where they're empowered to tell their story, right? And so what I was trying to do, and it's a learning curve for me as well, right? And I think I've improved as I go, but it's about saying to someone, what do you want to present to the world? How do you want to tell the story? What stays with you? And so in a way, it's about survivors taking back their story and allowing me as an interpreter to interpret their words, right? So it's this collaboration. So in a way, it's work about being empowered to share your story, about breaking the silence, about not being ashamed to show the world that this has happened, because it's your story and you're owning it, and it's okay to build community. So I would say this is for collectors who care about art that makes kind of that dialogue more accessible, that want to support survivors, because we're going to be donating a portion of this revenue back to either the survivors themselves or organizations supporting survivors, and people who are not scared to tackle the dark topics in the world. The world has them, and I think the more that we acknowledge them and build community around them, the more we can actually take them on to fix them.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a broad answer, isn't it?
No, that was good. That was really good. Yeah. There's so much here. And one of the things I want to be sure to touch on is just the concept of magical realism as well.
Oh, yes.
And what is magical realism? Where'd that come from? I love those two words together, but what do they mean?
Okay, so this is a terminology that I only came to retrospectively. So when I was creating the work, I wasn't even thinking about this. I wasn't thinking so much art therapy either. It's just that in retrospect, I can see where these pieces came from. So magical realism, I knew as a literary movement, right? And in Mexico, it was used by a lot of authors. And the example that I always keep going back to is like Water for Chocolate is a book where, she cried so much that she flooded the living room. Or she got so angry that as she, burned her way through the barn went on fire, And it's about kind of this extrapolation of a real feeling, a real emotion, a real experience, but extrapolating and showcasing that visually. So how do you showcase anger? You're showcasing it with fire, you know what I mean? How do you showcase pain? It's like, this flooding of a space. And so I always found those kinds of words incredibly visual and just so wonderful to imagine in my head. So when I was having these chats with survivors that started telling me things like, everything around me was a circus, which we have, the image circus. I can't remember anyone's faces, but just this sense that everything around me was like a circus. The moment he said that, I just in my mind started seeing the colors, and I started seeing that environment and that kind of chaos. And, and he said, I couldn't remember anyone's faces. In my mind, I'm already going slow shutter speeds, how do we make him crisp? And then everyone else. So I think a lot had to do with this kind of magical realism. You're taking something real and you're extrapolating from that and operating in a place of magic of the imagination on new ways of telling that story. And what's really great about magical realism is if I told you, tell his story, and I told 20 people to tell that same story with the same words that he might have told me, we'd each come up with a different visual. And so it's not really replicable, right? It's just what comes to someone. And I think that that's pretty magical. So I really like operating within that realm now.
Yeah, love that. Well, in the beginning when I did the intro, I said I introduced you as an author, speaker, cinematographer. What would you say is your the thing that defines you, that you'd want to be remembered by, when you're long gone 100 years from now, right? And someone's looking back on your body of work, and what's the main thread that runs through everything that you're doing, from the speaking to the photography, cinematography, all that stuff, that you'd want people to kind of instantly recognize?
I'd like it to be about breaking cycles, I think. Mm-hmm. And breaking cultures of silence, stopping the wheel turning. And I think this stems from learning more about my own family history and learning about abuse that happened in my mom's generation, my grandmother's generation, and then silence, and here we are. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So if I were to have a child, or if someone else in the family is to have children, I just want to have been known as someone that started to get the wheel turning to go in a different direction, because there's so many other different, more healthy options that we just don't know that we have access to, and we're surrounded by so much fear. So I think it's about that, about breaking negative cycles and finding new ways for things.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, and using, like I keep saying, using your skill set and your powers and your experiences to tell these stories. And it's storytelling at the core, right? It's all about storytelling. Yeah, whether it's, telling a story that's fictional or real. Right. And then what you're doing, you're adding that magical realism on top of it to, like I say, I use the analogy of you're feeding a dog a pill, right? You wrap it in bacon and he'll eat anything, right? So wrap it in some magical, realism, and, get that message into the brain of other people. Elisa, you at the beginning, you told me you are basically going to be traveling for the next several weeks, running around the world, doing different things. What's up? Like, what's next on your agenda? What's the next big thing on your calendar? There's a combination of shoots and film festivals and different talks and things going on. Basically, I always say my life's a bit of patchwork, because the reason that I identify as author, speaker, cinematographer, and two of those things don't go together, like speaker and cinematographer, you can't be in front and behind the camera at all times. Right. It's like an oxymoron. But I think that, I've got an exhibition in Dubai coming up in February next year called Exposure, which I'm very excited about. And we'll have a lot of the Spiral works and some other works, also prisoners of war and children with chronic illness. So it's using this kind of same methodology, if you will, but with different kinds of topics and trauma. And then I'm actually really looking forward to taking a break in December, because this year has been mad. I just got back from Ukraine a few weeks ago for another project that is to raise funds for therapy for Ukrainians, both online and in the country. So that's actually a commission that I had to design a knit jumper for a cause. And because I lived in Ukraine in 2019, I chose Ukraine. So the campaign's called Strong Enough. It's going to launch in about, I won't say the date because I don't know when this is going to be released exactly. It's going to be launched in November 2022. Soon.
Soon. So that's I'm editing that at the moment. So just all of it, I think aligning towards just building this kind of body of work, I suppose.
Yeah, I love that. You're such a bright light. It's a pleasure having a conversation with you. I feel like this interview could go on for another hour or so, because I have probably about another 100 or 200 questions to throw at you. But I know we don't have all the time in the world. I would love to invite you back on if you have time, maybe sometime next year, to come on and tell us about how these other projects that you're working on have gone once they're out in the world and have seen the light of day. So yeah, you should definitely come back. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It's been lovely chatting to you as well. Thank you for all your questions.
No, absolutely. No, thank you for your answers. If people want to connect with you or see the body of work, I'll have links, like I said, in the blog post for this episode, as well as the YouTube description. Are there any other places where you'd like people to go to keep up with what you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So number one, this NFT drop that Light Art is conducting. Thank you, Light Art. And my website is elisaiannacone.com. So you'll probably see that below. And that's my same Instagram, at Elisa Iannacone. So if you want to follow me there, always happy to connect with new people.
Elisa, you forgot the hand gesture with your last name. You gotta do.
Because it makes no sense, right? I'm born in Mexico. The last name's Italian. I mean, I'm a mutt from the get-go, right? It's like,
aren't we all? Aren't we all? That's awesome. Well, cool. Thank you again. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. I think this is a fantastic interview. Like I told you before we recorded this, I feel like this is one of the more important interviews that I've conducted for the channel. Thank you for that, and thank you for being so open about this sensitive topic.
Yeah, well, thanks for receiving it, making the safe space for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, safe travels. Have a great rest of your evening, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Okay, take care.
Bye.